new MacBooks, I tell you, they're kind of sketchy. Hey everyone. So my name is Harry Tormey, and today I'm going to be giving a talk entitled An iOS Developer's Take on React Native. So before I get into my talk, I'm going to give you some background information about me and my career so you can understand the perspective that I come to React Native with. So as you might have guessed from my accent, I'm not from California. I am from Ireland originally, but I've been living and working as a software engineer for the last 10 years in San Francisco. Now, for most of that time, I've been working as a native mobile software engineer. So I spent a few years of my career doing that, working with Objective-C and Java, making native iOS and Android apps at some startups in San Francisco. I then went on to work at Apple, where I worked in the core audio team, and I was working with Objective-C, C++, building audio APIs and applications to exercise those audio APIs. Spent the guts of 2 years there, and then I went on to work at Facebook, where I did absolutely no React Native whatsoever. Oh my God, shock. I spent most of my time working on the main Facebook iOS application using a library that was inspired by React called Component Kit, but mainly writing Objective-C and C++. I did do a little bit of React, a little bit of JavaScript, but I'm not nearly as awesome as all the people in this audience and the other speakers in that regard. So why do I tell you all this? Is this to say that I'm the most awesome developer in the world ever? No. I just want to give you sort of a flavor for where I'm from, because most people that I encounter who work on React Native background, they are typically web developers who want to leverage their knowledge of JavaScript and React to build really nice mobile applications. And contrary to what Ben said earlier, I'm not a recovering iOS developer. I still consider myself very much a native person. I am someone who likes React Native because it allows me to ship a certain type of application faster, better, and cheaper. And I love that. That's awesome. So I'm not a React Native evangelist. That's the evangelist picture up there. I wish I had that jacket. I am someone who's very much a native developer first. And I want to talk you through what will be going through the mind of maybe one of your colleagues who would be a native developer if they were looking at React Native. So the first question, you might ask if you were an iOS or an Android developer is, how does React Native actually work? And a really great place to go and find that out would be the Facebook developer docs. And if you go look there, what do you see? You see React Native lets you build mobile apps using only JavaScript. So when you hear the word JavaScript, and if you've been doing mobile development for a long time, you might think, is React Native a hybrid mobile app framework? So before I go any further, I want to take an impromptu survey of the audience. Hands up anyone who has built an application with React Native. OK, hands down. Hands up anyone who has built an application or worked with Cordova. OK, it's about equal, right? So the first question you might ask, if you're a native developer like me, who's just found out about React Native, is it a hybrid mobile app framework? And the answer to that question is no. The next question you might ask yourself, if you're new to this field, is what is a hybrid mobile app framework like Cordova? Well, the answer to that question, you can see in this picture up here. No, I'm only joking. I'm being a little bit mean there. I'm sorry about that, Cordova developers. So basically, a hybrid mobile app framework is a glorified wrapper around a web page. It's basically all of your UI is done with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. There are a few plugins to allow you to do stuff like locations, polling, maybe push notifications, offline file access, stuff like that. But basically, it's a glorified web page stuck into the Google and Apple App Store. Now, these have come to have somewhat of a bad reputation with old school native developers like with me and with a lot of users. If you go back to the early days of mobile development, 2008, 2010, they were all in vogue. Like Facebook, their mobile app used to be a hybrid mobile application. LinkedIn used to have one of those. Palm OS was basically like JavaScript and HTML5. It was meant to be the next big thing. So I think the reason why hybrid mobile apps have a bad reputation is worth exploring because a lot of native developers might conflate React Native with hybrid mobile app frameworks. So why do they have a bad reputation? I think it comes down to two main reasons. The first of which is that they use web views to render the UI. Now, if you think about that for a moment, having a web view in a mobile application render your UI fundamentally puts a middleman between you, the developer, and the underlying threading, memory management, and rendering system of the platform that you're targeting. It fundamentally constrains your ability to rebuild a native top-tier application. The second thing is if you go back to 2008, web development used to kind of suck. The state-of-the-art framework back then was probably something like jQuery. You'd probably find a lot of people who didn't even use jQuery. They'd roll their own JavaScript. And because they had to deal with a myriad of different web browsers that all have incompatibility issues like Yodlee Internet Explorer or Safari, it was really not a very fun experience. The good news that you all know because you're at Reactathon, which is an awesome conference, is that web development has improved a lot. And I think the story of why web development has improved a lot is worth exploring before we understand what React is and hence what React Native is. So why has web development improved? I think it comes down to three key things. The rise in popularity of functional programming across basically the entire software industry. Transpilers like Babel, aka the ability to write code in nice modern JavaScript or languages that are not JavaScript at all, and have that be converted magically into a form of JavaScript that can run on the device or platform that you're targeting. That's kind of awesome. And number three, the JavaScript language and the tools around it have improved a lot because massive multi-billion-dollar companies like Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft have pumped an absolute ton of money into making it faster, better, and more awesome to work with. So the framework that exemplifies all of these changes, I think, is React. And so it's worth exploring what actually is React. Well, if you were to give a very academic description of what React is, your UI is a function of your data. A more concrete example probably would be something like this, right? Like, let's imagine how we would implement a counter. You tap the button, the count goes up. What does this look like under the hood? Well, if we went back to our original description, your UI is a function of the count. And in code, what this looks like is something like this. So you have a render function, you have a div, and then within the div, you have something to display the count. And then you have a button that, when clicked, is going to do something to that state to update it. So the key thing to understand here is that this is not HTML. This is the virtual DOM. This is the description of our UI. So how do you update the state? Let's go back and imagine that sort of I or your colleague, the native engineer, is looking at this and is trying to put this together in their mind. How would you do this normally? Well, on Android, you'd get like a reference to your counter view, and then you'd manually set that. In Objective-C, you'd probably do something similar. You'd get a reference, or you'd keep a reference to the counter, and you'd update it. And in Yodlee JavaScript from back in the day, you'd either use this sort of horrible incantation up here with all of this stuff that's totally intuitive, or you'd do the jQuery method like this and reference something else. Kind of yucky. So how do you update state with React? You use the setState function. So if we went back to our original example here, right, we have a constructor, the thing that gets called when your component gets created. It sets up an initial state. The render function pulls the state, the count out from the state. And when you tap the button, it takes that initial state and adds one to it. So under the hood, the framework takes care of it, is the kind of like TLDR. But what actually happens is, as I said, setState increments the count. This results in a new virtual DOM, right? The virtual DOM is the description of what's going to be rendered, right? Because it compares the old state to the new state. And then React basically will spit out a DOM for your web browser to render. So again, here is this process illustrated with a graph. So how does React Native work? And why are you boring us, Harry, with all this information about React? Well, instead of spitting out a browser DOM, what React does is it takes this description of what the DOM is and it renders it with the native rendering system of the platform you're targeting. So instead of using a web view on iOS, you're using a collection of UI views, which are much more memory efficient. They're not doing all of that kind of crazy stuff. It's the same underlying views that you would get in a native application. On Android, it does the same thing, but with Android's native views. And on Windows and on macOS, it does similar things there as well. So let's have a look at the code and compare our web React component to our native React component and see what it looks like. There you go. Almost exactly the same. It's subtly different. You have a capitalized button, you have a view instead of a div. But to someone who's familiar with React and has done React web development, React Native is really not all that different conceptually. But it's really important to kind of keep in mind that it's not rendering through a web view. That's a kind of key point. So what actually happens in a React Native application is it sort of exists in two domains, right? So your business logic lives in the JavaScript domain, which is separate from all of the code that's used to handle your UI, process events, handle different threads, and do all of that kind of stuff, right? And these two domains are completely separated from each other. So if they want to communicate with one another, they have to basically send a message across the bridge. This is analogous to basically a client talking to a web server, right? So basically a bunch of events happen, they get serialized, they get passed across the bridge. Your JavaScript, which is going to do all of the business logic for when you tap on a button or do something else, processes these events, they get batched up, and at a certain point in the future, these events get serialized, put into a JSON dictionary or something like that, and thrown back across the bridge for the native side to actually ponder and do stuff with. So it's this cycle that's integral to understand how React Native is different from standard HTML5 hybrid mobile applications. So I'm not going to go into the details of this in any more detail. I'm going to leave that to a former colleague of mine, Alexander Kotalarski. He has a great talk called React Native Under the Hood, which I highly recommend you check out. So I described at a high level how React Native is different. What is the case for React Native? What would be the things that would make you want to use this? Well, the first one is performance. So not having to use a web view allows you to do a lot of different things. So you can have sort of an existing native app and have half your screen be basically a React Native widget. And it will look and feel like a native widget. It won't feel as different as, say, if you just dropped a big web view inside your application. And you can do the inverse of that as well. You can wrap your native components and have them show up inside your React Native application. So if you're working in an existing app, you can kind of go in both directions. You can't really do that with Cordova. So again, as I said, even though most of our app's code is written in JavaScript, the UI of our app itself is completely native. The UI is manipulated exclusively on the main thread, but there can be others for background computation. React Native does most of the heavy lifting in this realm for us. The JS realm, JavaScript, is executed in its own separate thread by the JavaScript engine. Our business logic, including which views to display and how to style them, are usually implemented in this line. So where do performance bottlenecks occur? Well, as I mentioned in a previous slide, there is a bridge. So all React Native apps have code running in two realms, so native and JavaScript. Variables defined in one realm cannot be directly accessed in the other. So this means that all communication between the two realms must be done explicitly over a bridge. Each realm by itself, really fast. The performance bottleneck often occurs when we move from one realm to the other. So in order to architect high-performance React Native apps, we must keep passes over the bridge to a minimum. So if you have a variable that's defined in native, if you want to get access to that, it's the equivalent of having basically to make a network request to a server and get that back. That's slow. If you're doing stuff like animation and you're not careful to use the native driver, or if you're using gestures, you can get into situations where you're basically putting a lot of traffic onto that bridge, and it can slow down your whole application. There are ways to work around most of these issues, but it's something to kind of keep in mind. So again, as I said, why is this not a problem? It doesn't use web views. It's easy to wrap native components, right? So if you need to rip something out and make it totally native, if you have native developers, you can do that. Optimizing the bridge in React Native is relatively easy. It's not a cure-all for all your performance issues, but it's not that hard to do. And issues like overdraw can be avoided by carefully choosing third-party libraries. So you also, as I said, have the ability to wrap native code like Objective-C and Swift. I go through some options for doing that here. That's really not that big of a deal. In Objective-C, it's just a matter of putting some macros around your functions and hiring an iOS developer like me. I'm available for consulting to help you out with that. Now, a lot of people have figured this out. It's not as hard as you'd think. I actually wrote an article on performance in React Native, which you can read at my Medium blog here called launchdoor.com. Please go follow me. It's pretty awesome. I basically optimized this really slow Android application that's loading loads of images from Flickr, and I tell you about how to do it. There's also some other really good articles on performance. I don't have time to go into this in detail today, but Tal Call from Wix has written 3 good ones. Recycling rows for high performance in React Native list views, moving beyond animations to unified interfaces at 60 frames per second, and he has another general one on React Native performance. They're really great if you want to nerd out and dig into that and build a proof of concept to convince your native engineers that React Native is not a terrible idea. If you want to play around with the demo and feel what it likes, the React Native Interactions app is pretty cool. It has lots of kind of examples of stuff that feel nicer than a Cordova application would. So you can kind of download that, screw around with it, and show it to your friends, and see if you want to try and steal some of that and build an application with it. You also have like a very rich set of libraries for doing things like animations. Like there's lots of different examples that you can find on the internet here. These are done by Nadir Dabbit from React Native Training. He has a great blog post about this. And the Animations API is pretty awesome. It supports native driver, so it can minimize passes over the bridge as well. That's included in some of the performance articles. So you can find these up in the React Native Training wiki, GitHub here, and Nadir Dabbit is another guy to check out. So examples of apps that use React Native. So Instagram isn't entirely written in React Native by any stretch of the imagination, but one of its features, its promote feature, does use it. Facebook uses it a little bit in their application, but there are some good examples of apps that use it. Another great feature, probably the biggest thing that I like as a native developer, especially if you've been doing Swift at all the last couple of years, Swift is pretty slow to compile. Working at Facebook, the Facebook app, before they kind of sunk tons of money and time into build infrastructure, sucked to compile. Hot reloading, you take this for granted, but like the ability to do stuff like this, where you go in and you kind of like edit like a section of code and have it like just turn up working like that without having to recompile, that's pretty awesome. Cross-platform apps. So I did some work for Ease, one of the sponsors of this conference here. They're a medical marijuana company. They have 2 apps. They have a consumer mobile application where you can sign up for medical marijuana, although it's not medical anymore, it's consumer. 90% of that, like we were able to share between our mobile applications. The Android application for their driver app, they have a delivery app. That had a lot of custom code that had to be written for native polling. So you do actually get like a win in that regard. And there are some issues kind of that you run into, like if you want to do things like make your app feel like material designs, you have to kind of special case some of the buttons and stuff like that. But a lot of your core business logic can be reused between mobile applications. With web, with most of the clients I see, they don't try and do fully tri-platform code bases because basically on the web, you don't really have to deal with navigation in the same way as you do on mobile. Error handling is a little bit difficult, and usually the web team and the mobile team are inherently decoupled because you have to still submit to the App Store. But all of the API code we were able to like reuse in that application, and a lot of other places have seen that be done. Over-the-air updates. This is another really great one. So you are allowed by the Apple Store Terms of Service to do over-the-air updates with JavaScript. Code Push is the product that most people use for this, although I think Walmart Labs have something good as well. The problem with doing this with React Native applications, however, you do have to be careful if you use a third-party library like camera library or something that does native navigation. If you upgrade to a version that has native changes in that within the underlying libraries, you won't be able to push those over the air. However, it's easy to tie code pushes to application releases. So what you would do in that particular case is you would release a new version of your app, and then you would code push to that and up. And if you do screw it up, it's really not that easy to, it's really not that hard to do a rollback with it. So that's pretty awesome, because I don't know about you, but I hate waiting to release software. And Apple, depending on what it is you're doing, can have you waiting a couple of days or more before they allow you to push an update. So that's pretty cool. I think the biggest win, though, or one of the biggest wins around React Native is team productivity. So if you're in a shop that has a really strong React front-end team, and you have basically maybe either no mobile team or you just booted up a mobile team that knows this, your web developers can review a lot of the diffs that you're putting out in your mobile team. Even though they're not doing React Native, they still speak JavaScript. They still understand good patterns for putting together business logic or touching on Redux and stuff like that. So that kind of throughput can be really, really good. And you can also go and look at, say, some of the web team's code and how they've been structuring their stores and their business logic, and you can copy that, even to the point where you can copy a lot of the layout. It's very, very close. So that's a big win. OK, so I'm going to talk about the case against React Native. Ooh. Ramp-up time. OK, so let me kind of break this down to you, because I've done a lot of training with people who come from a purely native background, like me, and people who come from sort of a JavaScript-y background. So basically, your native engineers, like me, will probably take 1 to 3 months to ramp up and be writing good React Native code. It takes a long time to do that. Mainly, not because JavaScript is hard or React is hard to grasp. It's more just if you want to build more than a trivial application, if you want to build an application with multiple screens, you have to start making decisions. And those decisions are not made for you by Facebook, such as, well, I want to store data. Should I use Redux? Should I use MobX? Should I use GraphQL? Should I use something that was written 2 weeks ago that just turned up on Hacker News? I don't know. I'm not a JavaScript developer. If you're an iOS developer, right, well, basically, Apple says you should use Core Data. Core Data has issues, but Core Data is pretty good. It's battle-tested. It's been around for a long time. Lots of successful apps like Slack use Core Data. Facebook used to be on Core Data. Not a bad choice, already made for you. Facebook, go out and find your own thing. If you want a navigation stack, right, well, you just use the one that Apple or Google have built in, and you might put some wrappers around that to handle different business logic or use cases. But with React Native, there's literally 5 or 6 really widely used navigation libraries. I have a whole talk on that. Which one should you use? What are the consequences of one or the other? So if you're coming to this, you're not like a lot of web engineers who are familiar with, say, Moment or all of these other JavaScript libraries that they can use directly in their app. You have to learn all of this stuff. So it's not that JavaScript is hard. It's that you, as people with a JavaScript background, have a big advantage in that you know a lot of different stuff. However, on the converse side of that, web developers have problems with mobile applications because they assume a bunch of things. One thing that they'll assume is the simulator that you run your code in, like your web browser, is the same as your device. It's not. Background code or any of the stuff that you interact with on the device, totally different. A common problem that you'll see that it might seem like a silly thing is buttons, right? The tap target is too small because you're used to tapping on it with a mouse. If you tap it with your finger, it feels different. Gestures, they're all these things that native developers know from having done this a long time. Web developers don't know. The other problem that you run into is the JavaScript toolchain at the best of times can be very complicated. Add onto that native dependencies, if you need to hook into a camera library or something like that, and you have all the brittleness of CocoaPods or all of these different libraries clashing and stuff like that, that can be really, really, really painful, and that can be something that's very far outside your wheelhouse. For native engineers, it's not really as big a deal to deal with, but that's another kind of example of ramp-up time. So usually what I say is someone who's an experienced React developer will ramp up to React Native in about a week or 2 because it's very, very familiar. Native developers will take longer to update, but they're much more valuable and much harder to come by. And they'll be able to do things that you won't, like write really high-quality native third-party libraries. So that's kind of my big sort of thing there. The other kind of thing that I would say is third-party libraries kind of suck. You know, as I said, there's 5 different nav stacks. Which one do you choose? You know, unlike native development that's been around for 10 years and has battle-tested stuff like masonry and things like that you're using, a lot of the third-party libraries that were written by React Native for React Native are web developers writing Objective-C code. The quality is very varied, so you really need to look at the Git issues and review them carefully. And also, you just have to inherently choose a lot more because unlike going to sort of like Apple or Google, where a lot of these frameworks are chosen for you, and you just use the ones that are there, and if you need something extra, you install CocoaPods or a third-party Android one, you have to basically choose pretty much everything that you're using yourself. And again, Redux is awesome, but like it took me a long time to learn about it because it's not just Redux. There's like 3Dux, Sagas, Redux Thung. What do these all mean? Sagas, there's like white papers associated with it. Do I need that? I don't have time to learn all of that stuff. So it's a big ramp up to learn all of this sort of stuff. Android is buggy. That's always been true. But on React Native, like, look, when React Native first came out, it was iOS first, and it was pretty janky, and it got a lot better, a lot quicker, because most of the people who work at Facebook are pretty affluent engineers, and we're living in San Francisco, which is a really expensive city. Android came out about a year after that, and it's been catching up, and it's been getting more awesome. But inherently, if you think you're going to write an app and you get another one for free, nah. There's going to be a bunch of time that you have to spend polishing that up and getting it like awesome. So again, this is just something to kind of bear in mind when you're thinking about it. So again, to sum it up, it's not as mature as iOS. Certain navigation stacks that you can choose will break things like accessibility, and you're more likely to run into performance issues, crashes due to the wide spectrum of devices and OS versions, which again, to be fair, is something that you'd run into if you were a native Android engineer, but it's exacerbated by React Native. Javascript. So I gave this talk, originally at a native developers conference a while ago. Some native developers really don't like JavaScript, and they're really not going to not like the concept of React Native. So a big thing that you'll run into if you're working in organizations that are doing brownfield applications is basically politics. And so, I think the organizations that I've seen that have done React Native really well, it's been the native developers or someone from the native team that's been the advocate for the technology in there. Because for all the reasons that I talked about ramp-up time, if you are like a web developer and you're just dumping a bunch of code into a native developer's world, that can cause breakages with their CI systems, and it's something that they are not going to necessarily be happy to maintain because maybe they don't want to be a JavaScript developer. So again, for some people, this is going to be a deal breaker. Some people are going to have just preconceived notions of what JavaScript was like back in like 2008 and say never again. But some people might have an open mind, but you just have to proceed with a lot of caution to convince people that React Native is actually a good choice for your particular use case. So should you use React Native? I stole this slide from this guy at Airbnb who has talked about this, and I've added a few more to it myself. So basically how I break this down is maybe. So if you know JS and React, if you have lots of web developers but few mobile developers, your design is more brand focused, like you're not trying to look exactly like the Google apps or the Apple apps. You do cross-functional teams. You have basically your backend developers and your mobile developers all sit and work on one product as opposed to just being on a platform team. You're willing to invest in React Native because, again, you're going to be solving issues with basically the libraries and frameworks that you're using. It's going to take time and it's going to require work, and you want over-the-air code updates. Maybe not. So if you're like a game shop, I would just use Unity. There's no point in doing this. If you're not doing multimedia, if you're doing a lot of multimedia stuff or a Bluetooth app, React Native is not going to really be much of a help to you. So again, like if you don't know JS and React, if you already have a really strong iOS and Android team, you risk pissing off all those people and they'll leave your company. They're very hard to hire. I'm serious, this has happened in some companies. And if your designs are very heavily platform specific and you have a culture where designers control release cycles very tightly, these are reasons to maybe not use it. So again, as I said, I'm going to finish up here very quickly. It's cross-platform performant, great developer experience, great community. Love you guys. Push updates over the air, backed by Facebook. Web developers can help with code reviews and ship features. Cons, politics, it's still bleeding edge technology, unstable, buggy APIs. They're getting a bit better, but there's still a lot of gnarly issues. Ecosystem is not fully developed yet, like it's getting there. Polished apps, if you want to make a really polished app, can be a lot of effort. And then again, you need to have someone on your team who knows native code. So anyway, thank you very much for having me here and talking to you. If you want to get in contact or hear my random opinions about native development, Bitcoin, and all the rest, you can follow me on Twitter at htormey. My Medium, I'll be posting more stuff about React Native up there. And if you want me for consulting, contracting, or to come train you, I do workshops with various different companies. Shoot me an email, and thank you very much.